Well, hello again. If you are tuning in online or if you're hanging out with my buddy Billy in Brewster, thanks for joining us today. Or if you're tuning in throughout the week, thank you for going back and watching this. We appreciate that. If I haven't met you, my name is Graham. A lot of people learn real quick that I have 4 children that I love. And when you have 4 kids, you go through this progression. Some of you know this progression, even if you don't have 4 kids. But when you first get married, people are like, it's like the day you get married. They're like, when are you going to have kids? And it's like, oh, settle down, man. I'm just trying to figure out how to take the training wheels off right now. And then you have a kid, and it's like immediately after you have a kid, they're like, so when are you going to have another kid? Right? And it's like, what is your problem? People need to watch more soap operas or something. I don't know. You have 2 kids, and then once you get to the second kid, then the question shifts a little bit. Then they say, so you guys think you're going to have another one? Right? There's this change, okay? And then you have your third one, and then the question shifts a little more, and people say, after the third one, they say, you guys are probably done, right? And then it gets even look weird, because then when you have your 4th kid, the question totally changes. They're not like, you're going to have another one, or you're probably done. They're like, please tell me you're done, right? Like leave her alone, okay? It just changes as you have more and more kids. But I'll be honest, and if you don't have 4 kids, you don't understand this. But everybody I know who does have 4 or more kids, it's the best. Having 4 kids is great. It really is great. There's so many things I love about it. Talk to any family that has 4 kids or more. It's fantastic. Now, I have a very strategic way of parenting. I kind of have one of those minds anyways that's always thinking strategically. And so as a youth pastor, I see all these kids come through the program, and I see things that I like, that I dislike. I see how people parent, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to take this, I'm going to take that, and very strategic about it. And one of the things that's always kind of surprised me is when we have our kids in our youth group that get to be seniors, and you're like, what are you going to do with your life? And they're like, I have no idea. And it's like, well, what have you been doing the last 18 years? Maybe you should have put the controller down for a little bit and thought about this, right? You got 18 years to figure out what direction you're going to head. Maybe you should have an idea. And so because of this, I ask my own children all the time, hey, what do you think you want to be when you grow up? Okay, you want to be this. What's going to take to get there? What are some things we can do right now to get you thinking in that direction? I'm very strategic like that. But that kind of gets screwed up when you go to your daughter's preschool graduation, and 7 kids in a row say they want to be a firefighter, and then your daughter gets up there and says she wants to be a princess astronaut ballerina. And I'm like, man, I don't know how I'm going to accomplish this one, right? I barely made it through high school. I don't know about either of those 3 things she wants to be. Or my son, he's wanted to be an engineer for a really long time. I'm like, yeah, be an engineer. That's good. Make good money. Takes a lot of education to be there. What can we do to get you there right now? And the other day he came home and we're like, hey, you still think about being an engineer? He's like, yeah, or maybe a rapper. And I'm like, oh. Again, have 4 kids. You get all these options, right? Now I'm banking on the 3rd one here, right? But I don't know what your strategy for parenting is, right? And you have all kinds of different strategies, but especially spiritually. What is your strategy for your child's spiritual life? And I think for a lot of us, we say, man, I've never even thought about that. I show up to church, and then on Sunday nights, I hand them to you, right? But what is your strategy for your kid's spiritual life? And you have strategies for all kinds of things in life, right? You've got a strategy for how to get ready in the morning quickly. You got a strategy. Half of you are going to go to Walmart after this, right? If you want to see the rest of the church, go to Walmart after church. They're all there, okay? You have a strategy for how to get around Walmart the most efficient way, right? You have a strategy for how you're going to get back into shape. You have a strategy for how you're going to retire. You have a strategy for how you're going to make your ex-boyfriend jealous of you, right? You have a strategy for these things. So what is your strategy for, I would say, the most important part of your life? Your child's spiritual life. What is your strategy? Because if your strategy is show up to church, do the child dedication thing that we'll talk about later, hope they get baptized and pray that's enough? Is that the strategy? My fear is, as Justin Earley says in his books, Habits of the Household, we need a strategy so we can produce something other than the typical anxiety-ridden, depression-prone, lonely, confused, and screen-addicted teenager. So we can form children in God's love, so we can train them in meaningful relationships, so we can teach them the peace that comes with knowing the unconditional love of God. So what is your strategy? And listen, I'll just be upfront with you. I'm going to ruffle some feathers today. All right? I'm going to make some people, especially if you have kids in your household, I'll probably make you a little bit uncomfortable. But here's the thing. Who speaks on behalf of your child's spiritual life? Right? You send them to school, you get emails, like 7 emails a day from their teachers that are saying they need to do this, they need to be ready for that, your child's behind in this part, you need to catch them up. Then you send them to a sport, and the coach says, hey, your kid's got to start working on this, and we need to send them to this camp, and yada, yada. And you've got people speaking into other parts of their lives, but who speaks on behalf of their spiritual life? Like, I don't really have a job description, but if I did, that might be in there. It's kind of my job to represent that. So if I offend you today, that's not my intention. Before you start sending me an email, like, let me get through all this. But I want to kind of start this conversation of what is your strategy for your kids' spiritual life? And listen, if you say, hey, I don't got kids yet, I'm free and clear. Or, hey, Graham, that ship sailed years ago, buddy. They are already gone. Like, you're not off the hook yet. All right? In fact, I would say your job as a community is just as important as our job as parents. And we're going to talk about that as well. I think we need a strategy because I think that's what it takes to develop good kids, to develop great kids. As the Reverend Dr. Kyle J. Plew has said to me many times, good kids don't happen by accident. There's a reason why good kids become good kids. And I experienced this at college a little bit. I went to a great school, and I had a lot of super successful friends. Like, when I hang out with them now or when I talk with them now, and I was like, they're literally, 2 of them are doctors. They do concussion research. One of them's a Green Beret. One of them does retirement planning. All these huge things. And I'm like, I eat pizza with teenagers, right? And I'm like, why am I at the same table? And what I learned getting to interact with their families was like, oh, there were some differences. Like, your parents had some crazy strategy. I remember walking from walking from the kitchen in my house to my room, probably with a handful of bagel bites, going back to play Xbox. And I walked past my buddy's room, and I peeked my head in there, and I said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm trading stocks. I was like, I don't even know what stocks are. I literally had no idea. But this is something his dad had developed in him. And I love this kind of stuff. As I said, I'm very strategic, and I feel my convictions very deeply. And so when I hear these statistics, or when I listen to, and I love listening to podcasts about parenting, I've read a lot of books on parenting or the lives of spiritual kids, stuff like that. I'll make some recommendations later on in that. And when I hear these things, I'm like, we have to implement these. I have to do this kind of stuff, right? When I hear the statistics about kids who own Legos versus who don't own Legos, I'm like, let's go to Walmart right now. We're going to buy some Legos, right? When I hear that teenage girls who have Instagram are 40% more likely to develop anxiety or depression, I'm like, well, not my girls, right? And I'm not fighting that battle yet. I get it. But there's no way when I hear statistics like that. You want to hear some crazy statistics? Just Google the benefits of eating dinner in your home as a family 5 nights a week. Okay? Has to be in your home. Doesn't have to be homemade food, but in your home at the table. Just Google that, and you'll start eating dinner at home more often. I read those, and I'm like, no, we got to be home. We got to eat dinner home. Those things just boil up inside of me, and I just take them so seriously. In fact, I was listening to a podcast not long ago, and the guy was talking about the benefits of men wrestling with their sons and the things that boys learn just by wrestling with their dads. And so I came home. I'd just been at the gym. I came home, and I'm talking to Kayla, and my son is overhearing this, and it's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I'm learning that I have to wrestle you more. And he's like, why? And I was like, I don't know. So you don't become a drug addict or something. And so I kind of start pushing him a little bit, and he's like not even 100 pounds yet. So it's easy now, but my time's coming. And so I'm kind of pushing him a little bit. I push him down onto the floor. I get him in a headlock, and he's like limp noodle. Like, he's not even trying. Like, and I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad sign. Like, I don't know. He's like limp noodle. So I got him in a headlock. I'm down on the floor, and I'm still having this conversation with Kayla because he's not even trying. And I'm having this conversation, all these things I learned in this podcast. And then all of a sudden, he comes to life, right? And he's trying to, use the opportunity to squirm out. And I said, whoa, what are you doing now, boy? And he goes, I don't want to be a drug addict. I was like, yeah. So, I don't know if that works or not, to be honest, but we're going to keep trying it. Listen, I love strategy, and I love learning these things. And again, as a youth pastor of 16 years, I see these strategies, and I see parents implement them and not implement them, and I get to see the product of that. And that drastically has affected my parenting. Okay? I don't think, though, anything has affected my parenting like homeschooling my kids, though. So 2020 was an interesting year, if you don't remember. And school was weird and stuff, and my wife was homeschooled for a little bit, so she's a little weird, and she wanted to take the opportunity to make our kids a little weird, so she was like, hey, let's homeschool the kids. I was like, that's on you, girl. I'm going to work. So we started homeschooling our kids around COVID, which I always like to give the caveat. It had nothing to do with the school district. Some people were frustrated. We weren't. We just worked better for our family. And so we started homeschooling our kids, and there's this weird thing that happens if you've ever homeschooled your kids. There's a day when all the neighborhood kids get out, they take their little pictures in front of the doorstep and those kinds of things, holding the little chalk sign, and they all head off to school, and your kids don't. And you have this realization where you realize, nobody's coming to save me, right? It is solely my responsibility to educate my child. Solely my responsibility. And so what I started to do, I was like, oh my gosh, well, I have to use every opportunity possible to educate them, no matter what it is. I don't even care what they're studying. Like, what are you curious about? Like, let's learn it. Like, let's get on YouTube. Like, let's do something right now. And this is still kind of ingrained in me. The other night, there was this super moon or something, and we were outside looking at it, and it had this partial eclipse thing, and my 7-year-old's like, why does it look that way? I said, well, that's an eclipse. And she goes, what's an eclipse? And I was like, let's go. All of a sudden, Graham Nye, the science guy, gets out. And I'm like, okay, let's go to a dark room. You get a flashlight. You get a basketball. You get a baseball. We're going to go. We're going to show you how to do eclipses, right? And I'm just in there teaching them about eclipses. Because of this time in 2020 when I realized nobody else is coming to save me. Nobody is going to come educate my child. And it's one of the most sobering, and I think one of the best things that's happened to my parenting. I really, really, really think so. Here's what I've noticed when you homeschool your kids. When you hear, loading first offensive comment, just so you know. When you homeschool your kids and you hear other people complain about the school district that's educating their kids, it doesn't sit very well with you. In fact, when you homeschool your kids, you have a whole new respect for what teachers and paras and coaches are doing for your kids. And I've just kind of noticed this shift where I talk with teachers and the things, especially teachers who've been teaching a long time, where they would say, yeah, the things I'm dealing with now with students are not the things I was dealing with 20 years ago. In fact, a lot of the things that our teachers are dealing with now, according to the ones that I've been talking to, are things that actually parents did 20 years ago. I had coffee recently with a local officer. It's been his first year as a police officer, and I was asking him, how's it going, stuff like that. I said, what are some of the weird calls you've been on? What are the annoying things? And finally, I don't remember what I asked him, but finally he said, yeah, I go on at least 3 calls a week. 3 calls a week where it's a parent telling me to tell their child to listen to them. I was like, are you serious? He goes, oh yeah, 3 times a week. was like, are you serious? That's crazy to me. And when I talk with other youth pastors, and we see this too, even within our own ministry, where all of a sudden it's like we're like parenting more than we used to. We used to be this kind of spiritual guide, and now it's become something a little different. And I know I'm using these extreme examples, and you might be saying, yeah, Graham, I've never called the cops to come tell my kid what to do, okay? But just hear me for a second. I think the tide of society has kind of risen in this direction. And when the tide rises, everybody rises with it, whether you feel it or not. Where kind of we've said like, hey, I want you to help parent my kids, or I want you to parent my kids a little more. But the truth is, and we're going to dissect this today, is it's our job as parents. It is your job to raise your child, and I think it's the greatest job you've ever been given. I think God gives us children because it makes us more holy and more like him. I think especially if you have a difficult child, I don't think that's some kind of curse. I think that's God saying, I'm going to give you exactly what I need for you to become more holy. And here's the thing. You get 18 years. You get 18 years to raise these kids, to have some kind of strategy that you implement and hope that it pays off. You get 18 years and then they're gone. And the sad part is like once they leave your house, right? Once they go off to college, military, trade school, whatever it is that they do, once they leave your house, 90% of your interactions with your child are now gone. You have entered into a new chapter where you will only get 10% of those interactions left. So it's pretty important that we work hard at this. And if we pass it off to somebody else, I think we are missing out on our greatest opportunity as a parent. Here's the thing. I'm a millennial. I'm an elder millennial. And my generation was known as a generation of entitlement. We were the most entitled generation ever. And now a lot of us are raising kids. And it is not our job to push that onto somebody else. In fact, I would say this, to define entitlement. When you think you deserve something and it's somebody else's responsibility to provide it, that's what I would say is the definition of entitlement. And listen, the only thing you're entitled to as a parent is the opportunity to raise your kid. That's all you're entitled to. I was reading a book not long ago, and as I said, now I try to implement these lessons into everything, and I was reading a book not long ago, and it was telling the story of two farmers. And one farmer is walking along the road, and he sees another farmer, and the farmer is leaning up on a shovel while his two boys are digging a new fence post for a broken fence. And the first farmer kind of puts his head down and smiles, kind of gives a little laugh, and he looks over at the second farmer and he says, "You know it'd go a lot faster if you just did it yourself." And the second farmer looked up and he said to him, he goes, "Oh, you think I'm mending a fence, but in reality, I'm raising sons." And this has kind of changed me. That book that I'll recommend later, that whole idea has kind of changed how I parent. And I want to look at a couple verses today, and these verses are not like your typical parenting verses at all. All right, I just be upfront with that. But one of them I want to look in the book of Deuteronomy, which is in the Old Testament. And the book of Deuteronomy is where God gives the Hebrews, he gives the Israelites, same group of people, Jews, all same group of people. He gives them the 10 Commandments, right? Kind of a big deal, right? It's a huge, huge time where he's freed them from slavery. He's going to dwell among them. He gives them these 2 stone tablets that the Jews actually believed he etched his fingers into the words. That's how they were written. Moses comes down off the mountain with them. It's a big deal. And here's what happens. It says, "These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that your children and their children after them may fear the Lord," or have reverence for the Lord is a way I like to look at that. Have the fear of the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, so that you may enjoy a long life. Okay, that sounds great. Keep the 10 Commandments, you'll have a long and healthy life. Then he says this, Israel, listen to me. The Lord is our God. The Lord is the one and only God. And this is a big deal. This verse right here is one of the most important verses in the entire Old Testament to Jews. They call this the Shema. And the Jews, if you're a traditional Jew, you practice Judaism, you would say the Shema every day 2 times. Every single day. So he gives them the 10 commandments. He gives them the Shema. Then he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Love him with all your strength. And some of us are like, oh, I thought Jesus said that. And he did, but he was quoting. And Jesus called that the greatest commandment. This is craziness. So 10 commandments, right? Gives them the 10 commandments. Then he gives them the Shema. Then he gives them the greatest commandment. And then what does he say to do with all this? Okay? The 3 biggest, maybe some of the biggest pillars within Judaism or Christianity. And what does he tell them to do with this? He says, these commands that I give you today are to be on your hearts. What do you do with them? You impress them on your children. And that word impress, this is the only place that we see this in the Old Testament. So it's translated a couple different ways. This says, impress them on your children, ingrain them on their hearts, teach them to your kids every single day, repeat them again and again, be diligent in saying these to your children. And he says, talk with them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. Tell them to your kids every single day so they will sink deep down into their hearts. That's what you should do with the 3 biggest pillars within Judaism or Christianity. You should teach them to your children every single day. And so you're like, what? Okay, Mr. Youth Pastor, I'm just supposed to talk about this? We wake up in the morning, we talk about this. I take them to school, and we talk about this. They get home from school, and we talk about this. Yes. Yes is the answer. Now, personally, I would institute a couple things to help. I would institute a strategy to help you with this, right? I would set up a system of household habits, personal disciplines, and exterior programs that'll kind of help set this up, right? Because you need kind of some other things. You can't just talk about this all day long. You know, they hardly listen to you right now, okay? So I would set a few things up, right? Just like, and I would say this too. If you're saying, man, I don't have kids yet, I don't know how this applies to me, this will work for your spiritual life also. You should have a strategy for your own spiritual life, and this will work for that. Here's the thing. As your child grows up, you have to act as the structure that holds these habits and these disciplines and these programs together until their level of maturity can hold it up by itself. Okay? And we see our kids, for some of them, we see that start to happen in middle school and high school. Their level of maturity starts to hold up these disciplines and these habits, right? Some of our kids, mainly boys, take a little bit longer, right? But that's our job as parents, is to hold that up, right? Maybe another way to look at this is, it is our job to buttress up their spiritual lives until they're strong enough to stand on their own. And this term, buttress, is actually an architectural term, okay? Here's what's really cool. I get nerdy about this kind of stuff, but if you study Christian history and you study architecture, there's a time when they cross paths pretty hard because all the new architectural advancements were happening because churches were getting built bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And so within church building, they developed this thing called a buttress. And it's literally just a big wall or pillar that stands next to the wall. And they figured out that if they build these buttresses next to the churches, all of a sudden they can build the walls taller. They can actually put bigger windows in the churches, which was a big deal because a lot of people were illiterate. And so the way that they learned the history of the Bible was looking at stained glass windows. Okay? So it is our job as parents to spiritually buttress up our children's spiritual lives until they can stand on their own, or even so that they go bigger and faster than ours ever has. Did you know that statistically your child's spiritual life will never outpace your own? Like they will never take their faith deeper than you've taken yours, according to what I'm reading and seeing. And I know, like, as I start talking about this stuff and habits and disciplines and programs and more, and you're like, Graham, how am I going to fit this in? With the girl, she's a senior. We're trying to get her the scholarship so she can go off. And the boy, we're honestly just trying to keep out of jail. And right now, you want me to set up some kind of system that's going to benefit them spiritually? I can hardly get them out of bed in the morning. And my answer is absolutely yes. Because what is more important? If you are a follower of Jesus, or even if you take spirituality seriously, which I think probably all of us do because you wound up in a church or you're listening to a sermon today, right? What is more important than your child's spiritual life? Right? What is more important to us? And here's one thing that I've learned that Kyle and I talk about. Kids want structure. They want discipline. They won't say that, okay? But they want that because they want to know that you have their best interest in mind. They want to know that you care, right? So when your parents, kids, when your parents implement rules that you think are stupid, it's not because they're stupid. And deep down inside, you know that. You know that they are doing something to protect you. You might not agree with it. You might not fully understand it. But that is why we do that. And when it comes to their spiritual lives, we can't be apathetic either, right? I think if we appear apathetic towards our kids' spiritual lives, we can't be surprised if we raise kids who are spiritually apathetic. So we got to put in the work. We have to develop a strategy. We have to add some habits and some disciplines, and I think use some exterior programs to help our kids along the way. And again, if you don't have kids, you don't fit into this category, this will work for you too, right? Let's look at, let's just hit some of these real quick. Some habits in your house, how is that going to affect the kids, your kids, and their spiritual lives, right? You have habits in your own life, how you eat, how you spend your money, stuff like that. And as you get older, you get to see how that benefits or doesn't benefit you. Okay? But what about the habits in your house? Justin Earley says, my habits are forming me into a certain kind of parent, and my parenting is forming them into certain kinds of children. Right? When we have habits, maybe we'll use the example of showing up to church. Okay? When you show up to church regularly, what is that teaching your kids? How is that benefiting them not just now, but also in the future? Okay? And I'm not a super militant religious, you need to come to church 50 plus weeks a year, yada yada, because I can see how that can become dangerous as well. But I would say we have to be careful when we let other things become more important than church. Okay? And this is more than just church. There's all kinds of habits and stuff. But when we let other things hey, we go to church as a family unless we're not feeling like it, right? What would that teach our kids down the road? Hey, church is important unless you're not feeling it, right? Hey, we go to church unless we have a sporting event, right? Again, I'm not saying you should go to church 50 plus times a year, but if that's the rule, if that's the habit in the household, what does that teach our kids long term? Church is important. Unless you have a sporting event, then church is less important. All right? And I could use 100 different examples. That's just the one that I chose today. Right? What about personal disciplines? What kind of disciplines do you have in your household or even in your own personal life that your kids are watching or that your kids are a part of? One of the examples in our house, I think it was 2 years ago, our son was baptized, and to me that was a big deal. I felt like baptism as a public declaration of his faith was something that I said, okay, your life has to change a little now, right? You're making a decision and you're telling everybody that you're a Christian, so what does that look like? So in our household, I'm not telling you have to do this, I'm just saying this is what we do. In my household, my 2 oldest kids are baptized, and so if you live in my household and you're one of those kids, you have to do a quiet time. 5 days a week, we do it at breakfast. We buy them whatever kind of quiet time material they want. They have little books, they have Bibles, they have all kinds of stuff. That's a rule in our house. That's a discipline in our house. I had a girl this last year who was getting baptized, and I asked her, I said, hey, why do you want to get baptized? And you know what she said? She said, I see my parents get up every morning and do their quiet times. And it got me thinking, there must be something real about this God stuff, right? The disciplines we have in our own lives are affecting our children, and the disciplines we put in their lives affect them as well. Lastly, let's look at exterior programs, right? We're super lucky. We have the best children's ministry in this valley and in Brewster, hands down. Hands down, we have the best children's ministry. We're super lucky to have that. Youth ministry, we might be top 5, okay? We're working on it, all right? But we're lucky to have that stuff. And we need to use that stuff. I mean, it is a huge benefit to have other people invest in our children, right? You know, if you've parented kids for a while, there's certain stages that you were good at, and there's certain stages that were more difficult for you. And here we have kids separated from birth all the way to their senior year, and we have people who know how to talk to them and work with them. Like, we're super lucky to have that, but you have to use that. Sometimes, if I'm being really honest with you, sometimes kids don't show up to youth group because they're fighting their parents to get there, or they don't have a ride, or it's something silly like that, where it's like, I really believe, and again, I'm biased because I'm a youth pastor, we need to be pushing our kids into those programs, pushing our kids to show up on Sunday mornings so they can get invested in Real Kids, showing up on Sunday nights or pushing them to go to their small groups. I had heard this quote years ago from Kara Powell, who's like a youth ministry genius. And I got to hear her speak live, and this is what she said about these things. She said, every youth group, every church service, and every small group is like eating a meal. How many meals have you eaten in your life, and how many of them do you remember? And then she said, but how many of them actually affected you? Every single one of them. This is why it's important. Listen to me, kids. This is why it's important that you show up to church and youth group, and especially your small groups. And you might walk away and mom says, how was small group that night? And you're like, But did it affect you positively? Absolutely 100%. Because every time you show up here, every time you check your kids into Real Kids, every time you go to your small group, as adults also, every time you go to your small group, you are eating some kind of spiritual meal. Now, are they all memorable? No, of course not. But do they all affect us positively? 100%. 100%. I talked with a mom not long ago, and she said, oh man, actually it was long ago. Oh, I hate it when that happens. She's like, yeah, my kid, he just doesn't want to go to youth group. And I just asked her, I said, why is that an option? When your kids get up in the morning, and I know we're still early in the school year, but when your kids get up in the morning and you're like, are you excited for school today? And they're like, no. Do you say, you know what, that's cool. Go back to bed, right? Or you're like, hey, Junior, take the trash out. And he's like, nah, you know what, Mom, I'm just going to scroll for a bit, right? Those are not options in other parts of our lives. Why would they be options in our spiritual life? And I get it. Listen, I get it. You fought battles all week long, right? You fought battles to get them to school. You fought battles to get them to take a shower, right? You fought battles to get them to stop fighting battles with each other. I get it. You fought it. You got to the weekend. You just want a break. But isn't this the most important part of their lives? I mean, when your kid leaves your house, what do you want them to leave with? I would think a relationship with Jesus Christ that can stand on its own would be at the top of that list. I would hope so. And sometimes we have to push our kids in order to get there. Now, here's the thing. I've been harping on parents the whole time, okay? Because it is your job. It is my job to raise my kids. But it's also our job as a community. So, nobody uses that verse I used a while ago as a parenting verse. Everybody uses this next verse, right? Every good parenting sermon you'll ever listen to will use the same exact verse, because a real pastor would just use the right verse. And it'll say, raise a child in the way of the Lord, and they won't deter from it, right? Proverbs 22:6. You see this on all kinds of parenting material, okay? Raise your kid or raise a kid in the way of the Lord, and they won't deter from it. And the way that I've always understood this verse is that this is a communal call, right? Train up or raise a kid, not your kid, a kid in the way of the Lord, in the way that he should go, right? This is a communal call to not you, but y'all. Raise up your kid. Raise up your kids in the way that they should go. Now, I had earlier I talked about like this buttress, this architecture term, right? And again, churches, as they were building them bigger and bigger and bigger, were using this buttress to get these walls to go higher and higher. But they found out that will only get a wall so high, higher than any building that they've been able to build yet, but it will only go so high. So then architects figured out that they could develop a different type of buttress that actually stood off the wall 6, 10, 20 feet, and it was like a spire that went up, and then it reached out over like an arm to push up against the wall even higher. And this they called a flying buttress. Now, sometimes they'll put a ceiling on that, if you've ever been in a really old church, and they'll have like the pillars that go down, and there's kind of these wings. Those are usually held up by this flying buttress, okay? Sometimes they're wide open, like you see in this picture. Actually, this one it must be your left, that's Notre Dame, right? And so they figured out that they could build these buildings even bigger and taller, and they could put more glass in them if they had a support system that wasn't touching the wall directly, but that was reaching out and touching the wall. And I think as a community, this is our job. Now, here's the beauty of Real Life. Real Life was started by 2 youth pastors, okay? Some very key volunteers made this place happen. But the first two staff members was myself and Kyle, and between the two of us, I don't know, we might have 40-something years of youth ministry experience, right? Investing in kids and teenagers is always going to be a high priority here. It just always is. And the culture is always going to bend in that direction. So this is where we as a community, where you say, well, I don't have kids yet, or my kids are long gone. This is where you come back in. We need you to reach out and support our kids from afar. Are they in your household? No. Is it still your responsibility to support them and raise them up? Absolutely, yes. And we see this happen in a lot of cool ways, right? One of them, the most obvious way, is we have volunteers that hang out with your children every single Sunday morning. We have another group of volunteers that hang out with teenagers almost every single Sunday afternoon or night. Not their own kids. They hang out with your kids, our kids, and invest in them. And to be honest, this is the most effective way that we're investing in kids from afar. It's been one of the most beneficial things. Again, I'm biased. I'm the youth pastor. It is the hardest ministry to be involved in. Kyle said that last week. The hardest ministry to be involved in. Absolutely the most rewarding. And anybody who's done youth ministry before knows that, right? We are super lucky to have the programs that we have here, but I'm going to just be 100% honest with you. We don't have enough volunteers in either of those categories. We get between 60 and 70 children every Sunday back here, right? That takes a lot of volunteers to do really well, right? Currently I have 14 volunteers that work with teenagers in this valley. There's approximately 1,000 teenagers in this valley. We are far understaffed. As Kyle said last week, there's plenty of work to be done, but the laborers are few. Right? And we would love for you to invest in teenagers or kids directly, right? You're saying, I don't have kids, or I'm not good with kids, I'm not sure I even like kids. Okay, we can find a spot for you. There's plenty of places. Yeah, I have people who invest in our teenagers in ways like this. They come and they cook meals, or they provide resources for me. I have a couple people that come to me every year and they hand me a check because they're so passionate about either camp or a mission trip or something like that. We have a team of ladies that just do check-in for your kids. That's what they want to do. You know, you're trying to check in 60 to 70 kids. That's a lot of work, right? There are ways to support. We have a group of ladies that put together goodie bags for camp and for our mission trip every single year. This last year, they wrote handwritten notes to every single person going on our trip. Right? There are ways to support kids from afar, and it is absolutely our job to do it. And maybe, as I talked with somebody this morning, maybe that's your grandkids. Maybe it's your job to support your grandkids spiritually, right? Maybe it's you that brings them to church. Maybe it's you that buys them the devotionals, that buys them the Bibles, that does the things like that. Maybe it's you that volunteers at VBS in the summer. But it's all of our job to raise our kids. I read a book called Hunt, Gather, Parent. Not a Christian book at all. But she looked at some of the oldest cultures in the world who have been parenting their kids traditionally like the same way for thousands of years. And here's what she found. All the cultures who've historically raised healthy and happy kids, they all did it communally. Every single one of them. She looked at Mayan cultures in Mexico. She looked at Inuit cultures in Alaska. She looked at an African tribe as well. And she found that all over the world, the ones that are raising healthy and happy kids, and they've been doing it for centuries, they all raise their kids communally. They all had other voices feeding into their kids. And here's a weird thing as we start to land the plane. Here's a weird thing. We have these weird things that happen when we say, children are a blessing. Right? Have you ever heard that phrase? Children are a blessing. And yet a lot of the times, like if you go to the park or you go somewhere else and you hear parents talk about their kids, the word blessing doesn't come up very much. Right? But I really believe this. And again, I have 4 of these. I really believe that kids are a blessing because here's what I've learned with working with kids and having my own kids. Having kids or working with kids will make you more loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, good, and faithful. You know that if you have kids. All of these things are fruits of the Spirit. That means these are all things that come from God. Raising kids will make you more holy. Or as Ruth Choi Simon says, motherhood is sanctification or sanctifying. I don't think that while I've given you a big task today, I don't think this is a burden. Developing your child's spiritual life shouldn't be a burden. It is actually a blessing because it makes us more holy in the process. Now here's the thing. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks right here. All right? You're like, I don't even know where to start. Let me help you. Okay? Number 1, read a book. All right? These are all going to be, all these next steps are going to be on your blue card inside your bulletin, which we look at. We pray over prayer requests in there all the time. If you check a box that say you're going to do one of these, we have people who pray for you in encouraging you, giving you strength to do these things. Okay? Number 1, though, is read a book. I didn't grow up with a dad in my household, so when I became a dad, I realized there's a lot of things I didn't know how to do, okay? So I turned to books, to podcasts, to sermons, to TED Talks, you name it, like just scavenging, right, for information. Okay, wrestle my son. He won't be a drug addict. Check, right? But I get all that stuff from research, which you don't have to read a book. You can listen to a podcast. You can do something like that. But here's the thing. Read a book. And I'm going to put a list of books right up here right now. This is not every book I've read on parenting. This is just ones I've read in the last probably 4 or 5 years. I have more books that I couldn't fit on this list. Take a screenshot of this. Just pull your phone out. Take a picture of this, right? Pick one of them and read it, okay? They're not all Christian books. They're not all even parenting books, to be honest, but they've all benefited me as a parent. If you're like, man, this is just a big list, Graham. I don't even know where to start. Come and talk to me. Or if you're dealing with something specific or you have kids that are a certain age, come and talk to me. I'll be right down here, right? Brewster, if you want to give me a call, you can get my information from Billy. And I'll say, I would start with this book. I would do this if I were you. But read a book. Your kids are worth it. Your kids are worth listening to or reading a book so that we can become better parents and we can develop them as Jesus followers better. Second, I want you to adopt a habit, discipline, or program for your family. As we talk through those things, probably something boiled up and you're like, oh yeah, we don't do that very well, okay? And maybe this is just a personal thing if you're trying to develop your own spiritual life. What habit, discipline, or program are you going to invest in? Next week, we launch small groups. That'd be a great one for your family. Just for you to get into a small group would benefit your children, right? Maybe it's starting to do a quiet time or a devotional time in the morning. Instead of scrolling through fantasy football, maybe you pull up the Bible app instead. Like, I promise that these things will benefit you. But just pick one of them and do it. Lastly, support from a distance. If you have grandkids or you got neighborhood kids or something like that, and you're like, man, that's my role. They're not under my roof right now, but that is my role to continue to support from a distance. Find a way to do that. Find a way to do that. If you want to volunteer in kids ministry or you want to start hanging out and help change teenagers' lives, we'd love to have you. I talked with a guy this morning. He says, how many of your kids that come to youth group don't go to church here or their families don't go to church here? I said, at least half. At least half of our kids that are showing up to youth group and small group, they don't have a spiritual guide at home. And we would love if you would choose to do that with us. But you need to support from a distance. We're all going to do this as a community. Lastly, I want to leave you with this quote. I heard this in a podcast, and I tried to go find who it was who said it, and I couldn't find it. But it's so good. Like, when I heard it, I thought, I want that to be the definition of my parenting. If I had to come up with like a hill to die on or a thesis statement for my parenting, this would be it. He says, the goal of parenting is not to produce what I want in my children and what I want to get from my children. The goal of parenting is to ask, what does God want to form in the lives of my children, and how can I be a part of that? Amen.